Well, for those who don't know me, my name is Sean Smith, and I work in the hazardous waste program. Today I'm going to talk about what it's like to be a park ranger. I did that for several seasons. I worked for both the Forest Service and the Park Service. And I'm going to talk about today a little bit about the differences between the Park Service and the Forest Service, the differences between being a park ranger and a forest ranger, and how you'll be able to identify the two. The types of different rangers that are out there, where I worked, some of the crazier questions I got, and some of the situations I got exposed to, and what I'm doing with my Park Service experience or ranger experience now, and much more. So, any questions?
No,
Well,
that's really interesting.
and if you do have questions, feel free to stop me at any time, okay? So I want this to be interactive. So, to start, does anyone know where this picture is?
Glacier National Park?
That's Glacier National Park. That's St. Mary's Lake, one of the places I work. So let's get started. So, right off the top, Forest Service, National Forest, National Parks, tomato, right? Well, no. Nope, they're actually two different agencies. The U.S. Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture and was established in 1907. The National Park Service, by contrast, is under the Department of Interior, and it was established in 1916. And in fact, it's having its 100th anniversary next year, and you will see a lot of activity around the national park system to celebrate that. And I would expect in August that the president will probably head to one of our national parks to mark the anniversary, which is, I believe, August 25th of 1916. And there'll be a lot of free events and activities going on over the next year, so check that out. So the National Forest Service, in a nutshell, they're two different agencies, and the major differences are on what they allow and the types of activities and uses that go on on their lands. The Forest Service is what's called a multiple use, has a multiple use mandate. So they allow activities that you would expect in a national park, like hiking and biking and things like that, but they also allow extractive activities like logging and mining and ranching. As you can see, most of the land of the Forest Service is in the western United States, with a few national forests in the east and a couple up in Alaska. It's about 141 million acres. I know that probably doesn't mean anything, but it's about 5% of the U.S. land mass. The Park Service, by contrast, is much smaller, and it allows a much more exclusive range of activities. So things like mining and ranching and logging, and even hunting for the most part, are restricted or eliminated in national parks. They tend to focus more on activities that give people a greater understanding or appreciation for the national park system. And as you can see, it's a much smaller system. Again, most of the parks are in the western United States, but it only has about 90 million acres. So roughly 2/3 of what the Forest Service has. But if you put those two together, the 90 plus the 140 million, it's actually fairly large. It's about the size of Germany and France put together. So we have a pretty big national forest and national park system. So forest ranger, park ranger, that's potato, right? Well, no, actually, there's differences. So obviously a forest ranger works for the U.S. Forest Service. And after you're done here, you'll have a real easy way of identifying the two, because this is me at Mount St. Helens when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service. And inevitably, we would be referred to as park rangers when we were there. And, you know, we didn't get offended by that, but there is a difference. So Forest Service tends to have a uniform which is tan and green with a baseball cap, whereas the Park Service wears green and gray, and only the Park Service wears the flat hats. So more often than not, if you see someone in a flat hat, you know they're a park ranger. But sometimes park rangers do wear baseball caps, so it's not always a sure thing that a park ranger won't be wearing a baseball cap. But if you see the flat hat, more often than not, it's a park ranger. So forest rangers are obviously in the U.S. Forest Service. Park rangers are in the Park Service.
Sean, isn't there a historical story behind
Thanks for bringing that up. Yes. So let's see if I can go back. So when the national parks were first established, it was about the first park was established in 1872. That was Yellowstone National Park, and it was actually established before there was a U.S. Park Service. The Congress, in its wisdom, set aside Yellowstone, but didn't create an agency to basically manage it. So at first it was civilians and private individuals that were patrolling the park, but things like poaching and logging and stealing of minerals got to be too great that the United States Army was sent in to patrol parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite and even Mount Rainier. And the Army at that time had these flat hats. And when the U.S. Park Service was established, they basically adopted the U.S. Army's uniform, and that's where the flat hats come from. Thank you for asking me. And those are the types of questions I want to get. So, you see a ranger out there. They're all the same. So, you know, ranger's in his uniform. They're all doing the same thing. Is that right? Well, no. There's actually 5 different types of rangers, and we're going to focus on the U.S. Park Service to start. So, the first one I want to highlight are your resource managers. There's a whole division in the Park Service that focuses on things like managing wildlife, taking care of cultural resources, taking care of the plants and other resources that we see in the national parks, and they do the on-the-ground cultural and natural resource management. The Park Service also has, as well as the Forest Service, a division of law enforcement rangers. These are called visitor protection rangers, and they are commissioned law enforcement officers, and their job is to enforce the law to basically protect the parks from the visitors, but also protect the visitors from the parks. They're out there, you know, basically interacting with the public, answering questions, but also making sure people have the proper fishing licenses, backcountry permits, those sorts of things, and other things such as not speeding and anything you'd see in a big city police force as well. Park Service also has its own maintenance crew. So, you know, people often don't think about it, but the garbage still has to be taken out in national parks. The bathrooms have to be cleaned. Campgrounds have to be maintained. And that's the division of the maintenance division, the work of the maintenance division. Now, in many instances, you see that the resource manager and the maintenance worker are wearing their baseball caps. The flat hat is really good for public interaction, but when you're out actually doing field work, it can get in the way, and so you'll often see the resource managers and the the maintenance workers wearing their flat hats. We also have a division which is called interpretation, and this is probably where most people, or this is the type of ranger that most people interact with. Interpretation rangers do guided hikes, campfire programs. They work at the visitor centers. They are usually the person that has the most contact with visitors and are responsible for pointing people in the right direction and making sure they have a safe and good time in their national parks. And then finally, the Park Service has administration. Just like any other big government agency, there have to be people that make decisions, things from government affairs to financial work to human resources. The Park Service, like any other bureaucracy, has things that they have to do and decisions that have to be made, and interactions with local governments and the Congress. So that's what the administration does. Did I always want to be a ranger? That's a question I get. So when I was growing up, my parents made it a mission of theirs to take my brother and I to national parks from one end of the country to the other. In the upper left, that's my brother and I. I'm the one kneeling up in Alaska. And then to the right, that's Badlands when I'm a little bit older. And then down at the bottom is Glacier National Park. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and my dad was from Montana. And every summer we'd go to Glacier National Park because my grandparents were there and it was nearby. And just a show of hands, has anyone been there?
I have.
Anyone? Yeah. It's a beautiful place. Yeah, it's a beautiful place, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I hated it.
Really? Why?
Well, when you're a kid and your friends are going places like on cruises or to Hawaii or Disneyland, and every summer we would go to Glacier National Park. I got a little bit, I guess, spoiled. And this is me in high school, and you can see I'm kind of getting a little bit snarky on these park trips. I didn't really enjoy them as much as I probably should. You know, you kind of get used to what your parents are giving you, and that becomes the baseline, whereas everything else that everyone else is doing seems to be, the grass always seems greener. Well, back in 1991, my dad took my brother and I one more time to the Mission Mountains in Montana to go hiking, and we then made a quick stop up in Glacier, and it was like seeing the park for the first time. I was really available and aware and wanting to come back, and so I was reawakened to the national parks and have really loved them ever since. So where was I a ranger? Well, it won't be a surprise that I was a ranger in Glacier Park. I worked there in 1992, and I was stationed at St. Mary, which is the easternmost portion of the park, but I worked up at Logan Pass. There's a visitor center up there. It's over 6,000 feet, and if you look closely down on the kind of left-hand side of that, there is a information station there. And I led hikes and gave programs up there. It was an amazing, amazing place. After that, I went to the Forest Service and worked at Mount St. Helens. It comes as a surprise to many people, but Mount St. Helens is not part of the National Park system. It's actually its own separate monument in the National Forest Service. The thinking on that is that many of the national parks, if we remember that first map we looked at, came out of U.S. Forest Service land. And it comes as a surprise to many, but the Forest Service and the Park Service at the very beginning had quite a rivalry going on, and many in the Forest Service got tired of the Park Service taking what they considered their best places, their best lands. And so the Forest Service kind of grew up a resistance to more national parks being created. And when Mount St. Helens erupted, there was actually a fairly strong effort to keep it as part of the Forest Service, so a national monument established in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest was created. So I worked down here at Pine Creek, which is on the Swift Reservoir, but my duty station was up here at Windy Ridge, about 40 miles away. And I made that commute every day, and I tell people that was one of the best drives of my life. It was incredible. Every day the weather would change, but it was an amazing drive and a beautiful place to work. I next worked at the North Cascades, which is in obviously the northern part of the Cascade Range here in Washington State, up on the Canadian border, and I worked at Stehekin. Has anyone been to Stehekin?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a difficult place to get to. It's regarded as the most remote community in the lower 48. The only way you can get there is by boat, by plane, or walking. There are no roads that connect Stehekin to the outside world. So once you get in there, you're fairly isolated. And it's an interesting kind of cultural dynamic when you work in such a remote location. And then finally, I worked at Yellowstone. And I worked at the Grant Village, which is in the lower half of the park on Yellowstone Lake. But where I did my evening programs, programs was on the West Thumb Geyser Basin. One of the smaller geyser basins, but it's got this unique kind of contrast between the geysers and one of the largest high alpine lakes in the world. And it was an amazing place to be. So what did I do? As I mentioned, there's 5 types of rangers, and I was an interpretation ranger. So I spent my time, a lot of it at the visitor centers, answering questions, thousands of questions, more often than not, the same question over and over and over again to multiple parties, but you get your answers down pretty pat. And then I led hikes and programs around the geyser features or out on through the forest. As I said, I've met over tens of thousands of people in my time working for the Park Service and the Forest Service. It was a lot of fun. One of the things you find that's a fun game that people like to play is called Stump the Ranger. It's whenever people come, they want to ask the question. What's that?
Oh, question. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi. A little while back, I had a question about.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the forest, Mount Rainier is Forest Service, and there was some discussion over whether it should be park or forest.
It's Mount St. Helens as part of the Forest Service.
So, is there any back and forth that goes on, and what's the process if it shifts from forest to park, or doesn't that happen at all?
No, it does. It still happens. There, in fact, are still national parks being created today. There's actually two ways that new national parks can be created, or parts of the park system. Let me see if I can go back, actually, to the... I'm going to go all the way back to that map. And then we'll zip.
More likely that forest would change to park rather than the other way around?
Exactly. Although some Park Service land sometimes reverts, it just depends. But more often than not, it is a bill is introduced in Congress to create a new national park, and it would be carved out of more likely public land. Although up in Maine, there's an effort right now to create a national park in northern Maine out of the Maine woods, and it's private land. And there's a woman up there, formerly owned Burt's Bees and Cosmetics, and she'd like to donate her land to the National Park Service. So private land can be added as well. But most national parks are created out of public land by an act of Congress. So Congress will pass a bill that will designate a national park, and then the president signs it. But there is also another way that park units can be established, and it's through what's called the Antiquities Act. The Congress back in 1906 gave the president the authority to create national monuments through executive order, basically. And then the president can designate where those monuments are managed. Is it the Park Service? Is it the Forest Service? Is it the Fish and Wildlife Service? Or the They cannot be called national parks. They have to be called national monuments. But inevitably, or often what's the case is once it's established as a national monument under the Park Service, Congress in the future often then redesignates it as a national park. And that's how the Grand Canyon was established. It was originally set aside by Teddy Roosevelt as a national monument, and then Congress later elevated it to a national park. So Mount St. Helens could be transferred to the Park Service through either an act of Congress, but I believe that he could also, or she could, through executive order, redesignate it as a national monument under the Park Service, although some lawyers differ with my interpretation of that, but I think the president could do that. Right now, though, there doesn't seem to be local support for that. I actually worked on a campaign for a number of years to transfer Mount St. Helens. The typical arguments you get is people are afraid that they'll lose access or they won't be able to hunt anymore, those sorts of things. But there are ways to address those. So thank you for your question. So let's move on to the next one. What did I do? So as I said, Stump the Ranger is a game that people like to play. And when you first become a ranger, you're often terrified that you're going to get that question you can't answer. You know, park rangers are expected to know everything, from when the sun comes up the next day to what's the best wine that goes with trout. We get questions across the board. So, and you have to stay on your toes. But as I said earlier, 90%, 95% of the questions tend to fall within certain ranges. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, you know the answers to those questions, and you know more than, the vast majority of the people that come to the park. But occasionally, you get people that know more than you do. So, for example, we get questions along hiking along trails, and people want to test your knowledge of flowers. So they will say, well, what's that flower? And I often like that. So I'd stop my group And I'd say, okay, we got a question up here. Someone's pointing out this flower and wants to know what it is. And what I would do is I would turn to everyone, I go, are there any botanists in the group? And then there'd inevitably there'd be silence, and I'd say, okay, that's great. No one's a botanist? Well, then it's this. So, but you would get the questions. You'd have to say it. But you want to test your audience too to see if anyone else knows what it is. This, by the way, is a shooting star. So,
Glacier National Park, Sean?
yeah, that was in Glacier. Yeah. The second most popular question I got while working for the Park Service and the Forest Service is, where's the best place to see wildlife? Can anyone guess what the most popular question was?
Where can I see a bear?
Anyone else?
The restroom.
Where's the bathroom? That's the number one question. Exactly.
Well, I worked at Crater Lake.
Yeah. So, but inevitably people would want to know where's the best place to see the wildlife and at what time, and more often than not they want to be guaranteed that they'd see the wildlife. Places like Yellowstone, Glacier, we had a pretty good chance of if we told them to go to a certain place that they would see things like the elk up in the left corner, less likely to see the moose, almost never see mountain lions or badgers, but a good fair amount of time you could see bears as well. The best times to see wildlife are probably not a surprise, early in the morning or just after sunset, because animals are like us. They like to avoid the heat. So during the middle of the day, they're bedded down or in the shade. But if you get up early or stay up after sunset and go out, you're likely to see them there. The other thing I would tell people is that if you want to increase your chance of seeing wildlife is get away from your cars. The vast majority of people that come to the national parks don't get more than, or to at least the parks I worked at, don't get more than, say, 300, 400 feet from their car. You go a mile into the backcountry and you will have lost 99% of the visitors that go to national parks. So, and that steeply increases your chances of seeing wildlife when you get out actually away. And I would tell people, your tax dollars pay for the entire park, so you might as well see more than just what's on the road. So that's one of my advice for seeing wildlife. But then you asked, where do we see a bear? So when I was on leading my hikes, predominantly at places like Glacier or Yellowstone, people would ask, so what do we do if we see a bear on this hike? And I'd be guiding them, and I'd say, okay, how many people are concerned about seeing a bear? And, a number of people would raise their hands. And so when I said, well, here's what we're going to do if we see a bear. We're going to stop. We're going to face the bear, and we're going to make a real tight circle around the ranger. And people would inevitably do the same thing that you just did. They would laugh and say, "What, is he serious?" And so I go, no, come on, I'm joking. Who's really concerned, And we'd get a little kid, that would come up, and I would say, "Come up here. I want you to be right next to me. I know you're concerned, and I'm pretty certain I can outrun you." So, once I got people comfortable, again at Glacier Park, people were it was the second most popular question, but people were rightly concerned about bears. But I also would tell them that you're more likely to, trip and fall in the parking lot or be hit by a car than you are to be to have a problem with a bear in our national parks. So when we went out on hikes, you're in a big group. We would make lots of noise. We'd clap our hands. We would stay together. And I'm happy to report that in my groups, we never came across a bear or had problems with bears. They are solitary creatures. They want to be left alone. And if someone were to come into your living room unannounced, you obviously would be concerned. So what we do out of respect is we hike in groups. We make lots of noise to let the bears know we're coming. And upwards of 9 times out of 10, if they get the alert, they are long gone before we even get there. So just make noise.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah,
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so when my husband and I were in Glacier this summer, we saw a bear right on the side of the road, and it was quite alarming how many people were within 10 feet of the bear, trying to take pictures, get selfies with the bear, and the bear was just kind of eating some leaves or something, some twigs.
Yeah.
And eventually kind of ran off. So my question is, like, what was your experience with people approaching wildlife and getting too close? Did you ever have that happen when you worked at the park?
Yeah, it happens all the time. This picture actually here is from Yellowstone, and that's from our car. So that bear is, maybe 15 feet away. And there was, 50 cars there watching this poor bear. But, like I said, for the most part, their job, as soon as they get up in the spring, is to put on as much fat as they possibly can so they can survive the winter. They are cranky in the early spring because they're hungry. They haven't eaten in several months. But they aren't out marauding looking for people for the most part. So even when people get out of their cars, the bears, for the most part, will leave them alone. They're just busy getting food. When they get like anyone else, if they're really annoyed, yes, they will attack people. It's very rare, but it breaks down to, more often than not, the bear is surprised that the person has come up. A hiker is hiking by themselves. They are hiking late at night, or they surprise a mother and cub. Those tend to be the factors that lead to people getting mauled by bears. But yeah, when I was in the Park Service, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here on some of the crazier situations, people tend to put their mind in neutral when they come to national parks. They tend to think their things are protected or well managed, or there's no chance of anything going wrong. And you see that when people jump out of their cars and they're right next to bears, or in many cases to bison or elk. More people get injured by the bison and elk than they do by the bears because they just don't respect them as much. And bison, they're huge and can run very, very fast. So it's good practice to give the animals a wide berth. We tell people for the elk and bison at least 100 feet, if not more. And the bears, 200 yards is probably safe when you're outside, that you want to give them a wide berth. So, besides the kind of normal questions, we often are also asked these just crazy questions that we have to know the answer to as well. So, I was at the visitor center one day in Yellowstone, and this man came running in all excited, and I was the ranger at the desk, Ranger Smith, which he thought was hysterical because it's the ranger from the Yogi and Boo Boo commercials or cartoons. So I got that asked a lot. Where's Yogi? But he goes, Ranger Smith. And I'm like, yes. He's like, do you know what happens to a bag of Doritos when you drive from New Jersey with them and come here to Yellowstone? And I said, do they explode? And he's like, yes. Why is that? So his bag of Doritos blew up in his camper, and he was all surprised and couldn't believe it. So we had to know things like the different air pressure. So if you buy Doritos at sea level and then go up over 7,000 feet, the air inside that bag expands to the point where the bag can no longer hold it, and he had a Dorito bomb in his car. So we also get people confused as to where they are. So at Mount St. Helens, invariably people would come up and say, where is the Crater Rim Drive? And we would scratch our heads, and they said, no, I'm pretty sure there's a road around the crater rim that lets me look right into the volcano. And we would look at our maps and say, well, no, actually the closest you can get is the Windy Ridge Visitor Center, or Overlook. Inevitably what we found out is people confused Mount St. Helens with Crater Lake and believed they were at Crater Lake, and there is a Crater Rim Drive at Crater Lake. But there isn't one at Mount St. Helens. But people were pretty adamant that they knew that there was a Crater Rim Drive and that we were preventing them from taking that drive. At Yellowstone, when we get in the visitor center, we were kind of dumbfounded at first when people would ask, well, where are the high cliffs and waterfalls? And it took us a while to figure out that, and eventually we'd say, well, those are about 1,500 miles away in California. People, when they go to Yellowstone, confused it with Yosemite, and people that go to Yosemite often confuse that with Yellowstone. So it's amazing to me that you can go to a place in Wyoming and think you're in California, but it does happen. Was there a question?
I said they both start with Y.
Exactly, and I think that's what it is. We call them the Big Y parks, and you get used to it, and you just say, yeah, they're in California. We would get some kind of silly questions as well. Things like, I know people are probably tired or not really thinking, but questions like, which beach is closest to the water? All of them. Or yeah, which beach? Or things. Which, and this is Ape Cave in Mount St. Helens. We would get questions like, how much of Ape Cave is underground? All of it. So you kind of try to figure out what the person is really meaning. I think with being with that question of it underground, they're wondering how much, like a flashlight, do they need to take? Do they need heavy coats? Those sorts of things. So you often have to read between the lines, but sometimes you just have no idea what the person is asking. But speaking of underground, at Yellowstone, for example, we would meet other people that were convinced that there were caves there that we weren't telling them about. So I got on several occasions people coming up and asking me where the UN tunnels under Yellowstone National Park are. There is a fairly large group of individuals who believe that Yellowstone is a secret base for United Nations troops. And that there are tunnels under the park where those troops are hiding. And so, you know, I was just your average summer seasonal ranger, and I'd tell people, look, you know, I'm just a GS5 ranger. They don't tell me everything, but there are billions of gallons of boiling hot water under this park, and I seriously doubt there are UN tunnels. And people would then say, or this one gentleman said, oh, you're one of them. So believing that I was in on the conspiracy, but you know, those are the types of questions we get. Speaking of conspiracies, parks and forests tend to bring out people, as you probably rightly know, from all walks of life. And often at visitor centers, people show up that, let's just say, haven't talked to anyone for quite a while. So I remember one instance we got a gentleman come in who wanted to talk about the Apollo moon hoax, that it was his belief we never went to the moon, and he just wanted to talk to anyone that would listen about it. Well, when you're behind a desk, you're often a captive audience. You're stuck. You can't really leave, so you have to basically engage with this person. Well, we rangers developed a little way of getting out of those situations. We would signal to our partner that something as innocuous as, it looks like the weather's changing. And then that partner would disappear and then go on the radio and call over to myself and say, you know, Ranger Smith, we've got an emergency. We need you back up at the front here. Can you come forward? So it was kind of a way to get out of some of those more difficult or very long time consuming questions. But some of those were the most exciting part of the day. When you're out in some of these places there, especially at Pine Creek, we didn't see very many people all day. So the moon hoax guy was actually a nice diversion. So along with crazy questions, we also get into crazy situations. When I was at the North Cascades, and I didn't know this before I went in, but there's a fairly large rattlesnake population in the North Cascades. And like bears, people want to see them and want to interact with them. And so one day I'm at the visitor center, and this visitor comes in running all excited and says, there's a rattlesnake down on the Stehekin Landing. The Stehekin Landing is where the boats come in, drop people off, and there's a lot of people down there. So having a rattlesnake down there is not good, probably for the snake or the people. So the visitor's looking at me going, well, what are you going to do? So this was my very first rattlesnake. So I grabbed my flat hat and I walked down there, and sure enough, there's a rattlesnake sitting on the landing on the deck, just sunning itself, not really caring about anyone. And everyone's looking to me to basically handle this situation. As I said, I'd never seen a rattlesnake before in my life. So I just kind of went around and said, all right, let's just back up. And I called one of the law enforcement rangers and had her come down with me. And when she got down, she was terrified of this snake. She didn't want to get within, 5 feet of it. So between the two of us, and everyone's watching us, we figured out, all right, here's what we're going to do. We got a big garbage can, and then we got a stick, and we just kind of shuffled the snake into the garbage can, and then set it upright. And then we're able to translocate this snake away from the landing and get it away from people. But, this is basically, like I said, I had just kind of figured this out on the fly, but this is the type of stuff that people expect park rangers to know and handle. And this is a pretty typical day. We also are, if trained, required to help fight fires, and I did that for one summer up in the North Cascades as well. If anyone's seen fires on TV, it's pretty dangerous. It's very labor intensive. It's very active. It can be dirty and smoky and dusty, and they're always interviewing firefighters, and they're at camp or wherever. But what they don't tell you is that when you're out fighting fire, especially in a very remote location, basically what you have is what you've got on your back. You've got your axe or your Pulaski, you've got your helmet, you've got your Nomex shirts and pants and boots, but you don't take tents, you don't take sleeping bags. So we got out to the fire line and we started fighting, and then when the sun goes down, the fire tends to go down, but it gets so dark that it's not safe to fight anymore. So you basically stop fighting at night, and we're out in the middle of nowhere, the sun's going down, it gets cold, so what do? You sleep right next to the fire. You sleep on the burned side of the fire in the dirt, and as the evening goes on, the fire is really low, and it'll start to creep, so it's moving away from you, so you tend to creep with the fire. You just kind of stay a couple feet away from it to keep warm, but then when the sun comes up, almost as soon as the sun comes over the horizon, the fire will jump right back up again. So it goes from just a tiny little several-inch flame to flames that are over 10 feet tall within a matter of minutes. And as soon as the sun's up, you're up and you're fighting the fire again. That's the type of stuff they don't tell you in fire school, that you're going to be sleeping on the dirt next to the fire. Earlier you asked about people with wildlife and interactions and getting out. One of our job duties was breaking up animal jams. These are traffic jams that are caused by people stopping their cars to get out and look at the wildlife. This is in Yellowstone. There's a bison there in the middle of the road, and I would tell people that we got so good at telling what type of animal was at the front of the jam just by the cars. So before you even get to see the animal, you can tell what it's going to be by how the cars are parked. So if cars are parked on one side of the road, say in Yellowstone, it's probably an elk. If cars are parked like this on both sides of the road, it's probably bison. And if cars are parked on both sides of the road and, they're abandoned and people are running all over the place, it's probably a bear. And so we would come up and have to get people back in their cars and get them moving again, because as you can see, it would take several hours to get that jam cleared up. But like that bison in the middle of that jam, if he doesn't want to move, we weren't going to move him, and people would sit there for hours and wait for that animal to keep going. So you tend to figure things out just by the way people act. So what do I do with my park experience now, and why aren't you a ranger now is another question I get. Being a park ranger was one of my favorite jobs, and as I mentioned to some of you earlier, it was a seasonal job. So most park rangers that you see are only there for the summer seasons. Probably upwards to 80 to 90% of the park rangers over the summer will be somewhere else in the winter. A lot of park rangers are teachers, others are retired, and so getting a permanent job is very, very difficult. And when I was a ranger in the 90s, there was a hiring freeze on permanent rangers. So I had to make a decision: do I want to continue to try to get a permanent job and live out of my car, or do I take another job I was offered in San Francisco? And my parents, I tell this story, my parents had changed the locks on their basement, so I had to take a permanent job in San Francisco. But what I do now is I'm taking my kids to national parks. When I worked for a nonprofit that worked to protect national parks, I told them that one of the reasons I protect national parks and want to work to protect national parks is so that I have the opportunity to inflict upon my children the same types of things that were inflicted upon me by my parents. The kids, thankfully, my kids see it as a lot of adventure and fun. They aren't quite teenagers yet, so I'll be curious to see how they experience the parks when their friends maybe are going to Hawaii. But for now, I am exposing them as much as I possibly can to the national parks. But I'm also doing some other things. I was at a movie theater one time in Jackson Hole and watching a James Bond flick, and James was doing all these amazing things, rappelling off cliffs and flying planes and a whole bunch of what spies normally do, and or shooting guns and shotguns. And as he went through it, I'm like, well, as a ranger, I've done that, and I've done that, and I've done that. Just about everything short of capturing terrorists, I had done what James Bond had done. And that got me thinking that there needs to be a book series of park ranger thrillers. And so I've actually started writing those. These are my first two novels. The first one was set in Yellowstone. It's called Unleashing Coulter's Hell, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the second one is Lost Cause, and it's set in a bunch of Civil War sites. When I was in Yellowstone, it's the world's largest supervolcano, and it's active, and it's erupts on a cycle of about every 600,000 years. And as it just so happens to be, it's been about 600,000 years since it last erupted. And while I was walking and leading hikes, I was going, I wonder what would happen if this volcano were to erupt. And then I was like, I wonder if someone could get the volcano to erupt. And that's what the story of Unleashing Coulter's Hell is about. It's about an individual who's trying to get the volcano to erupt and what that would mean. And so there's a park ranger named Grayson Cole whose job it is to stop that. Lost Cause is the second novel, and it's, as I said, we get a lot of conspiracy people that come to national parks. And in writing this novel, I was struck by the idea of the recent kind of dust up over the Confederate flag. And I started thinking about if there was something out there that might lead someone to think they could start the second Civil War. And what would that be, and how would they do it? And basically it's a chase, this book, Lost Cause, through a number of national parks on a search for a relic that could supposedly start the second Civil War. And again, Grayson Cole has to stop it. And then my third novel, which is going to be set at Mount St. Helens, or not, excuse me, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier. The first UFO sighting in the United States was at Mount Rainier. And so this book is about a object that's been trapped up on Mount Rainier since 1947. And Grayson Cole is there again, and he's in the middle of a conspiracy to keep it covered up and prevent the world from finding out. So I write novels, and that's my website there. So people also ask, what have I learned since being a ranger? Well, I've learned in my time of working for the parks and visiting parks, I've been to over 200 national parks out of the 400 national parks, and hope to get to see the rest while I'm still on the planet. But what I've learned is that the national parks and forest system are an amazing gift to us. Our ancestors could have developed those parks. They could have used them or sold them off to private developers. But instead, they set aside their short-term wants and desires so that we could enjoy them today. And it is our duty and our responsibility to manage them and pass them on unimpaired to future generations. I know we can do it, and if people are motivated and dedicated, that we will pass on a park service and forest service that were better than the ones we inherited from our ancestors. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean.
Any questions?
So, Sean, recently the Land and Water Conservation Act, Congress let it expire. What do you think that means for national parks?
Doesn't mean it's not good in the short answer, I guess. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is actually royalties that come from offshore oil drilling, and so a portion of the money that the federal government collects, goes into a fund that then can be used to buy property to expand national parks or protect U.S. forests, that sort of thing. It was supposed to be about $900 million a year. It never got to that level, and Congress just this past year, it came up for renewal and they allowed it to lapse. So it was the #1 vehicle for buying new parklands, protecting areas, and it's sad that has been allowed to lapse. I know there are a number of conservation groups that are working on hoping and hopeful that they can get it reauthorized, but I'm not optimistic in the near term. It probably won't be till the new Congress, but yeah, it's disappointing. So if you're concerned, I would tell people to write Congress and tell them to reauthorize the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Sean, I have this fan. I have
Can you
a
turn the
5-year-old and an 8-year-old. What's your top 3 favorite parks for kids?
what are they like? What are they interested in?
Running around.
What
Aliens, but then like
Yeah, aliens.
boys.
Well, it depends. So, like, my daughter is into science and history and things like that. So, one of the things I didn't mention is that 2/3 of all national parks are cultural or historic in nature. So, we tend to think of the big iconic parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite, but most national parks are places like Klondike Gold Rush downtown in Seattle. It commemorates the gold rush that took place in 1899 for here in Washington as miners went up to the Yukon. But things like Yellowstone, I don't think you can beat for kids. I took my kids there. What I like about places like Yellowstone is it's got the kind of the developed front country, so you've got incredible hotels, restaurants, things like that kids tend to like. You know, you can go get ice cream. They've got a junior ranger program, but you also have amazing wildlife herds. You've got the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. You've got geysers. It's almost a perfect park, and there's something around every turn. If Hollywood were developing a park, they would pick Yellowstone because it's almost another world. So Yellowstone's amazing. Closer to home here, Glacier Park is incredible as well. You've got the east and west side are very different. The west is very wet, so you tend to have bigger forests. The east is dry, so it tends to be open, and you have more dramatic views. The hiking can be more strenuous, more demanding, but there are a variation of hikes as well. So, and they have a strong junior ranger program there too. And I'd say, you know, for really close by, Mount Rainier is a great park for kids as well. And what I like about that is it's close to us, so you can develop a relationship over time. What's really great about parks is seeing them change through the seasons because they present different things at different times. And I tell people I get very, I've gotten very spoiled with my national park experience. If just a weekend trip isn't enough, I like to spend 7 months in a park. so that you can see the elk change over time, or you can see the bears come out of their dens. So what I like about the proximity of Mount Rainier is that you have the ability to go on several weekends to say, hey, look, the snow's melting in the spring. Now the flowers come out the summer, and then the snows will come back in the fall. So those would be probably my top 3. Other questions?
I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the book.
Oh, you read my book?
Yeah.
Which one? Is that Linda?
I read both of them.
Yeah. Oh, right. I can't see you, Linda. So yeah. Well, thank you. I'll give you your $5 for making that plug later. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just waiting for you to finish the next one.
I'm working on it.
I didn't even know you wrote books.
Yeah. Well, if you see
on my Kindle that I've read.
yeah, if you
That's what I was going to ask you. Is
yeah.
it available on Kindle?
It is. Yeah. If you see me at lunch, I'm often writing on my computer, and that's when I'm writing my books.
It's back in the corner right over here.
Yep.
Computer every day at lunch.
Yeah. So those are that's my Facebook page.
Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I want a cameo. Yeah, I want a cameo in that book.
All right.
I love UFOs.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, Sean.
Bye-bye.